Hi everybody, I'm Rich from Order Employment Services. Welcome to the People Prescription, your dose of HR wisdom. The podcast today will welcome Barnaby Cook, who's a learning and development professional. Welcome Barnaby, would you like to just introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi there, Richard. Yes, certainly would. My name is Barnaby Cook. I spent a long time in call centre environments and then took my passion for making learning work, became a primary school teacher, the greatest kind of period of my career, so enjoyable. Then left teaching and went back into call centres and noticed there was a bit of a difference between how things are taught professionally in a formal education setting as opposed to businesses where they kind of make it up as they go along. And so using my knowledge of the two kind of sectors, I decided to sign up for a master's at Staffs Uni, which is where I met Rich, and I've been helping businesses to redefine their learning offering ever since.
Absolutely. So just on the back of that, as Barnaby was sharing there, we both did a entrepreneurship masters at Staffs University. And one of the key learning points for me, really, from an entrepreneurial perspective in that journey that we're on together, really, is that entrepreneurial mindset and, entrepreneurship in general requires adaptability. And with that, it sort of introduces today's topic quite well. So today we're talking about Gen Z, millennials, and the adaptability that's required from business owners when engaging people from different generations. So that could be Gen X, it could be baby boomers, Gen Z, or millennials, as we were saying earlier. So today we're going to talk a little bit more really and have a conversation about generational differences, if there's any misunderstandings within the workplace in terms of how we can address different mindsets within the workforce. And we're also going to touch on some general stereotypes as well. We've done quite a bit of research leading into today's conversation, and we've really just highlighted some of the key stereotypes that are out there, which we're going to go through step by step today throughout the conversation. Hopefully we approach this with an open mind, folks, as I'd recommend everybody does that's listening to the podcast today. And with that, if we can address any sort of challenges that you're facing as an employer with engagement in terms of Gen Z and millennials or other generations as well, that's exactly what we're here to do. We're here to encourage a conversation about it. So with that in mind then, Barnaby, the last time you and I spoke, there was quite a good analogy around workplace culture and how you can spot cultural challenges perhaps that are faced within organizations. And you mentioned something about observing the kitchen area and observing more so the tidiness of the kitchen area. Would you like to expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, it's one thing I've noticed wherever I've worked is that the kitchen can often be kind of a litmus indicator for the general overall health of the company. Right. And I kind of guess people go into the kitchen with kind of a focus on, I don't know, making tea, coffee, whatever. The company culture really defines how they leave that kitchen. Once you've made a cup of tea, do you put the spoon in the dishwasher? Do you clean it up? Do you make sure the milk's back? And I guess all companies, to an extent, will face challenges in their custodianship of the kitchen. But I guess the way in which it's dealt with has to change, really. You can't really read the riot act anymore. You have to engage everyone and you have to show them there's a communal area. We all need to respect it. And really, the drivers of which of how we shape our office culture, the drivers have definitely changed. So where before it was all stick, now really what a lot of the evidence is saying, let's have a bit more carrot. And it's ultimately more successful because you achieve a lot more with sugar than you do with salt.
Absolutely, yeah. I think energy can be infectious, and when you're developing an environment where the energy is such that you're providing outcomes for people, how they get to those outcomes is actually up to them, and that's very much along the lines of transformational leadership. So using your example there, if you're a business owner and you're minded that your kitchenette or your kitchen area isn't as clean as it needs to be, then the key thing initially is to make it incredibly clear for everybody within the team exactly what outcome it is that you're looking for. Now, in terms of how they get to there, the last thing I would suggest is micromanage people to the extent that, they believe they're going to be policed in the kitchen. But what I do think is incredibly important is making it very clear. And energy, when we're talking about energy, a lot of the time people think about movement, people think about the environment that they're in that helps manifest some of that energy that's needed. And really, the first thing to do from a cultural perspective is make it incredibly clear the outcome, what you're looking for as a business. And again, we'll feed into this in terms of your learning and development piece and how we can approach this from a learning and development perspective. But the outcome's very, very useful, because what that allows you to do is to make sure that everybody's ships are sailing in the same direction. Once you've given somebody a very clear destination about the outcome that you're looking for, how they get to that outcome, some of the best leaders that I know let the employee find it out for themselves, because typically there's several ways of doing things correctly. And as long as you've got a system in place that shares those outcomes or those values within an organization, how people get to it, some of the best leaders that I know of, they're not as concerned about the how they do it, as long as the outcomes achieved within a reasonable period of time. And most of the time, if you're hiring people who share your values, the way in which they achieve those outcomes are actually quite unified with the approach of the business leader themselves. So yeah, I think it's really important that when we're talking about these type of things, we've got to try and understand that we need movement, we need energy in the direction of what outcome it is that you're looking for. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're using the stick approach, as you were saying there. You know, the carrot is much more useful, a lot more longevity when it comes to certainly generational differences. When we're talking about this later today, the way you approach it may be slightly different based on the type of the audience that you're speaking to. So whilst we will be covering generational differences, and there may well be some stereotypes that we're sort of drawing on here, that's based on the research that Barnaby and I have been doing, looking at social media, looking at trends within the workforce, and how we can approach those different trends when it comes to generational differences within the workforce as well. One of the observations that I've seen recently around Gen Z especially is that there seems to be a trust deficit within that particular generation. And I think, you know, if we talk about economic recessions, but actually I think that we're in a state currently within the UK where there is a trust recession. And the way you build trust, in my view, is by essentially repeating the same task, the same message. And CEOs say this constantly to me, you know, 40% of their time is spent repeating themselves. And usually my answer to that is that actually that's a good thing, because it demonstrates that they're trying to build repetition around the values that they're trying to build within that organization, around some of the outcomes, as we were talking about a moment ago. And that can be an incredibly helpful process for people, because ultimately people learn from experience, people learn from that repetition of going through a process and doing it that much that it becomes second nature to somebody. And this can be the same for any skill, for any outcome that you're looking to do. The more reps that are put in place, the better. Another bit of feedback I get as well, which again, I'm interested to hear your take on this too, is that some organizations that I speak to can be very mindful of mistakes being made, and that the processes they follow are trying to reduce the number of mistakes being made within the organization. And my view on this is slightly contrary, in the sense that I believe that if mistakes are being made, it is actually an opportunity for further learning, innovation and growth. But it also means that decisions are being made within that organization as well. And to create an environment where people can learn in a safe way, I think is the first step towards doing that. So what would be some of your observations from a learning and development angle that could assist businesses and business leaders to create that safe environment, perhaps where mistakes could be made initially, so it facilitates more innovation, more adaptability, and also more employee engagement?
Well, it's interesting you should bring that up, because one of the things we went over on the course was learn to fail, but learn to fail fast. So
Yeah.
if you're incorporating that into your company culture, that you can fail, but if you proof it in a way that the failure is mitigated, then you're going to get the benefit of the learn. We tend to do what we've always done because we're creatures of habit,
Right.
but the world's changing. The pace of change has never been as fast as it is today, nor will it ever be as slow as it is today. So if your company culture is embracing the ability to fail and fail fast, you're really setting yourself up with a potential to move forward a lot more beneficially. The thing that will back that up is now Ofsted are actually looking, rather than seeing pages and pages of ticks, they want to see that children have failed. A, because that means it's tested them, it's
Yeah.
took them out of their comfort zone. And part of life is failure. So we really need to be building in those skills in which we can then be resilient enough to fail and then deal with the consequences.
Right, that's interesting. So it seems like that Ofsted taking a slightly different approach. I mean, drawing back on my days in education, in school especially, whilst it was fantastic for learning facts, learning information, and being assessed on the information that's been learned, I think at the same time, it wasn't as useful from a self-awareness perspective. I didn't have the opportunity to develop the self-awareness that I've had, in work life, in opportunities in different roles that I've had in leadership and in tactical and advisory roles that I've had. So when I was at school, I had a sense that failure was a bad thing, that you would do everything you possibly could to avoid failure. But actually, I think ultimately there's a certain power in being outside of your comfort zone. And,
It's
if
where
you,
growth
especially,
happens.
yeah, exactly. And I think, where you're in a system that promotes comfort, and the comfort being that you remember a certain item, you get tested on that item and you pass, that isn't necessarily the most creative, or it's not necessarily the most process driven of environments to be in. And I think certainly from a business perspective, most business leaders I speak to accept that if they're in an environment that's complacent, if it's comfortable, then they're not growing as an organization either. So, sometimes finding people who you can have a thoughtful disagreement with, or somebody who's perhaps changing the dynamic or the different sort of perception of a task, that can be a very useful exercise to hopefully find a solution that works within that business too. So from an L&D perspective, I mean, what would you draw on, especially given the education background that you had as a teacher? What did you find was particularly useful for pupils, students that were learning items, or how that can translate into learning within the workplace?
The first point I would make is telling someone is not training. So there is a massive misconception that I'm going to tell you and I'm going to assume that you're going to go and retain that. It takes 20 hours to become competent in a skill. So if you are training people in the workplace, build in that application time. Try and make it as equal as in presentation time, doing time, because you will see the benefit, because there's something called a cognitive load, and you can only take on so much. When you were learning to drive a car, you didn't sit down and watch a PowerPoint in a classroom. You get in a car, you learn a car by sitting in a car and doing. So if you can equalize that balance, then you're going to gain a lot more success. I think also having clear objectives as to what it is you want your learners to be able to do after that time. All time in a business is investment of one sort or another. So part of my role is to demonstrate return on investment. And the way you do that is by showing that you're pushing the needle. What you're doing is affecting the company's bottom line in a positive manner. So by having clear objectives, you can then measure against your learners' ability to meet those. And then you've got some data. And as we know in business, data is one of the critical things in decision making.
Yeah, and what kind of data would you be suggesting to use as like a key measurement for somebody's understanding? I mean, what kind of assessments would you suggest? Or I appreciate there might be differences depending on the type of role as well. I mean, if we're talking about an entry level role, most employers accept that there's an aspect of coaching and training that's needed in order to develop an individual who's ultimately learning. But at the same time, if you've got people perhaps who are hitting the ground running, how would you recommend that they're assessed? What kind of outcomes would you be looking for from an L&D perspective to develop that confidence that you've made the right hire?
Well, it's interesting because everyone is so unique and specific. So it's hard to apply blanket terms to them all. But I guess what part of my role is to assess what excellence in the role is and then work back. So you would work back to the starting point of your learner. So if you've got a more advanced learner, you don't need to work quite so far back. and then you can put them in a role where they can cope with the challenges. But then again, some of your learners or new employees are going to need extra time, and they're going to need smaller increments. So you've got to assess what their potential is, where they are at the start. And then if you really, really drill down into what makes excellent in the role, what are the KPIs, what are the key factors that you've got to hit, then you can build waypoints. And it's kind of like almost like a treasure map to success in that respect.
That's interesting. So how would gamification fit into that picture? Because one of the, again, this may well be a stereotype, folks, but again, we're here to sort of open the lid on these things and trying to get a conversation on the back of this podcast as well. But one of the stereotypes that seems to be pushed at the moment is that the Gen Zs seem to be more open to gamification, millennials too, to a certain extent. Is there some merit in that, would you say, Barnaby, from a learning and development perspective? Would that make it more sticky, the actual material that they're trying to learn and understand?
Well, stats show that if you gamify something, you get 50% retention, whereas if you give them a PowerPoint, you'll get 5% retention. So I guess what gamification does is it kind of drills into the drivers. Gen Z as a generation have got more recourse to leverage on those drivers. When you and I would have been starting our first job, it was clock in, be on time, don't make any trouble, keep your head down and grind out. What we're seeing with the generational changes, we are giving generations a more idealized version of the world. So, and they've got more immediacy with their ability to purchase things. Mm-hmm. What you're looking for is a way in which they can get a relationship with their work that demonstrates to them that there's a benefit in doing it. And gamification is one of the ways where we kind of hijack these neurochemicals of dopamine and so forth, and we use them to keep people engaged in their work and also kind of build a better relationship with the outcome of their work, rather than having just this transactional, I'm going to turn up at 9, I'm going to clock off at 5, and I'm just going to live my life until the weekend comes.
Understood. So from what you've shared there, some of my observations really about, I was listening, very much to the different aspects, and perhaps immediately what came to mind was that actually the current environment that people are in, especially from a Gen Z perspective, millennials to a certain extent, they're subject to so much social media. The immediate, from a HR perspective, I'm thinking the impact it could have on attrition. So we see these shows, these entertainment blogs and vlogs around Love Island and, all different types of where there's a judgment being passed on somebody, or it kind of glorifies the not being loyal approach of, well, we can just move on to the next one or the next one. And that, I find, is a real challenge for some employees, where they invest a lot of time in developing an individual to begin with. And immediately, the moment something isn't necessarily in line with the vision of the individual employee and the business, they part ways without thinking about, actually, we can work through this and have a thoughtful disagreement. Another observation as well I find important is that from an environment perspective, this idea of perfection is constantly in the media, and we see this in social media. We see this on many different platforms where there's some kind of immediate validation that's needed. When you post something, there's a like or a comment, and actually in reality, life doesn't work like that. So it's about how can we meet these people halfway to develop an environment within the workplace where there is a validation. Surveys perhaps would be one idea. If you're surveying your team, in understanding, developing really key communication skills as well, I'd say would be another one. But would you say that technology here could potentially be a hindrance, in the sense of it creates a gap, that perhaps Gen X and baby boomers didn't experience? My view on it is that, the Gen X's, the baby boomers, the way they work, that they like to write it down, whereas perhaps people from a millennial perspective or a Gen Z perspective, a lot of their ideas are in the head, and it can be difficult for them to convey that. And the way I see it is, like, how can we bridge the gap here? Is this something where we've got somebody perhaps like a millennial that's in between these two generations that can bridge the gap between the two, having seen or experienced the pre-internet environment compared to the post-internet environment that Gen Zs have always known. They've always grown up with that.
That's an interesting one, because technology is only going to play a more dominant role in our lives, isn't it? There should be ways in which technology will play a part in forming productive office cultures. If I think back to one of my earlier roles, I went over a year without a one-to-one. And I know for a fact that that affected my performance, it affected my faith in the company. It didn't make me feel good about going to work. Now, you don't have to have a one-to-one every single day, but you could have regular check-ins when you're in the kitchen washing up. You can, talk to people about their roles. You can be quite dynamic with it. You don't need to set specific time. But I think the frequency with which you have these conversations, more often and less, is better than big and infrequent.
I agree. I think, from a HR perspective, from a people strategy perspective, I mean, really what we're talking about here is feedback. And feedback is incredibly important within an organization to develop trust, more so, where people understand that actually the feedback works both ways. It's not only a case of people feeding back that, they've done something wrong, or it could also be suggestions and really good areas that can be suggested from an employee's perspective to develop a process. I do believe that processes are important. A feedback process is critical as far as I'm concerned within a healthy organization, because the best ideas come from the people who are delivering the service or creating the product. They're on the front line, really. So to not listen to those people, a lot of the time, some of the best ideas come from people on the front line, because they've got first-hand experience of how the product or the service is landing with the target market that a business is catering for. So it can be very, very useful. I think the one-to-one process, in my view, it works very well on a bi-weekly basis. Some businesses I speak to, depending on the nature of them, will do them weekly, as a check-in. And it's that communication is where it's not in place. It can create a huge barrier for organizations in terms of their growth. And that's where you've got to communicate things like the vision, the mission that you're on as an organization. Very, very important to create that environment where there's a certainty. And from there, you get people also that as you start recruiting, you're looking for people who share those values, that vision and that mission that you're on within the business. From a learning and development perspective, what's your mission then, Barnaby? What's your vision really for learning and development over the next few years?
Well, I would like to see a little bit more science applied to how we train people in our workplaces. I'd like to see real clarity in the learning objectives, take a curriculum approach so that you can really define what success in a role looks like. You can mark out the steps. And I think what needs to happen really is we need to look at the person as a whole, rather than them just being a resource or an asset. Yes, you're paying for their time and you're paying for their skills, but people aren't just their time and skills. There's parts of people's personality that enrich our workplaces just through the nature of what they are. And you can't put figures on it and you can't monetize it specifically, but we really need to be aware that our workplaces have moved. If you look at the Great Depression, where people were queuing up to do manual labor because work was so scarce and they had very real needs to put food on the table. Where if you look at, we've just come through the Great Resignation, which you as an HR expert will know more about. We really need to kind of key into, look at the person as a whole, what their drivers are, and let them express themselves and the better elements of themselves in the role, just so that they feel that they come to work as the best version of themselves.
It's interesting you mentioned there about the Great Resignation and also that aspect of personality in the workplace too. In my view, there needs to be a variety of personalities within an organization to ultimately get the best outcomes for that group as well. It's interesting you mentioned about the Great Resignation, Barnaby, and we're talking now 2021, 2022, just on the back of the pandemic. And there was a huge increase in resignations across the United States, across the UK. I believe genuinely it was about people having that opportunity to take stock of their situation in what was an incredibly difficult time for many, many people, where some people felt isolated, they were on their own, and they were on their own with their own thoughts about how they wanted to find purpose in life and ultimately, there was a huge amount of resignations on the back of that. Now, what I find is now employers are certainly a lot more open to discussing how we can engage with their people teams and not only view them as a productivity asset, but also view, in my view, your people are your greatest asset, the biggest cost for an organization. I always suggest to employers that your biggest costs are walking around on 2 feet, and you can't get around the numbers when it comes to wage bills, when it comes to national insurance contributions. From my side, it makes it incredibly more important that if employers are going to make those decisions around who remains within a business, who's leaving from a business, to make sure they've got the right people on the bus to begin with and sat in the right seats, more importantly, as well. So from a personality perspective, what they can do is assess things like psychometrics, utilize assessments to establish the dynamic within the team to make sure it's a dynamic that can thrive and achieve the objectives that you're setting as a business. And a good example of that would be perhaps you need people who are a bit more data driven compared to inspirational thinkers. And it's not to say that data driven people are more valuable. It just really depends on the task at hand. So you're going to need all aspects of these types of behavior and personality within an organization in order for it to thrive. And I don't think there's one hard and fast rule. It's unique for each business that we speak to, really. But there needs to be, and this is underlined here, the adaptability of having different personality traits, speaking, talking, having conversations, almost thinking out loud about some of the problems that face that particular company and that employee that they're working with. And you usually find that the solutions come through a lot quicker. They're a lot more effective as well, where we're bringing those types of different personalities together and trying to overcome those challenges as well, which I think that's where it becomes very important that employers have an open mind to utilising that kind of support. But also, when we talk about the pandemic, something you and I have spoken about before is this social anxiety amongst people perhaps who are of a younger generation that went through the pandemic, and older generations too, to a certain extent, people who are not as comfortable talking in groups, not as comfortable working in a team. So it's how can employers introduce methods to get people working together more closely without necessarily having the need to experience anxiety when they're in groups. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Is that something you've observed when it comes to training people in different generations?
Yeah, certainly. I think I first came across social anxiety and training people, I think 2017, 18. I
Right.
just noticed that the training regime that I was conducting had a lot of group activities.
Yes.
Looking back, it would be quite easy to do a bit of an assessment on the learners, work
Yeah.
out what their individual needs are, and then, tailor that so that they could still contribute, but just not in such a overwhelming group scenario. So there is lots of resource out there about doing these assessments. You'll obviously know it as being from the HR world. You'll know exactly how to do that. In teaching, you obviously have a whole special educational needs suite of tools that you can use that's available for you. But again, we come back to this idea of outcome, and we need to kind of be adaptable in the way we do things in order to create the outcome that we want. All business runs on outcome, and we can influence that for positive and negative in the way that we adapt and design things.
Can it be simplified in your view, Barnaby? Do you think there's something that businesses can do to simplify this process so it can be implemented quite quickly? So when we talk about outcomes, my view on this is that if you've got different processes within an organization, then typically for each process that you're following, there's perhaps 5 outcomes that a business leader could share with the team to say, look, as long as we're achieving X, Y, and Z, and there's perhaps 5 of them, no more than 5, then it gives people a lot more clearer instruction, understanding of what the destination is that they're working towards. I mean, you mentioned something earlier about reverse engineering. I'm a huge fan of reverse engineering. Once you know what the outcome is, you can sort of reverse it back from there. Not everybody shares that view, but at the same time, I think there's things that businesses can do, especially if they have that entrepreneurial mindset, to make their team's life a lot easier in order to achieve the objectives. And sharing perhaps 5 outcomes would be useful. I mean, what are your thoughts on how to simplify this process for businesses?
Well, I guess one of the things I would say that would simplify it is be prepared to get it wrong first.
Yes.
One of my pet peeves is that people very often mistake the intention of an initiative for the outcome they want. So what did you do? Oh, we did X, Y, and Z. Did it work? Well, we think so. So we were talking about failing fast. Go into it with the idea that you're not going to get it right first time, and that's okay. By having a go at the first time, you were going to find one way nearer to getting that happy path to confident learning.
So embrace an aspect of uncertainty, make it clear for people that having made mistakes, that's a positive thing, because ultimately decisions are being made and learning, there's feedback that can be taken from those challenges and how those individuals grew and how they overcome them. Again, drawing on a bit of Chinese philosophy here, Barnaby, but Confucius said there's 1,000 lessons in defeat, but only one in victory. So ultimately, that's where the growth is. It's understanding what lessons can be learned from some of the challenges that people have gone through and adapting, utilizing that feedback in a way which makes the business stronger and also the outcome stronger as well. As far as I'm concerned, it has a massive impact on the bottom line of a business.
And I suppose that's particularly pertinent for our newer generations, the Gen Zs and the millennials. So if you think about humanity evolved 200,000 years ago in the Paleolithic era, and Gen Z are the furthest removed from that origin. So kind of they're operating on hardware that's not been designed for the reality that humanity has created. Stone Age man didn't require Love Island or X Factor or, same day delivery, for example. So, all those neurochemicals that were put there to ensure the proliferation of our species are operating, but in a different reality. So, we talk about the carrot and the stick. You can't take a stick to people and say, well, you should be able to buckle down. You shouldn't insist on things being to your liking. You should be grateful for a wage, because that's just not the reality for them. And we're not moving in that direction. Life is becoming more and more kind of sanitized, idealized, harm-proofed. So Gen Z really have got that expectation of that's what reality is. 40% of them say they've got mental health issues. So that's an increase on previous generations. So mental health is not extrinsic to our health as a whole. You can't be as productive as you would like to be if you're suffering from a health ailment. And what you're saying earlier about perception, 54% of them say they trust influencers. They are getting messages on what life should be. I know that Donald Trump pivoted to TikTok and he managed to get significant gains in the Gen Z vote. So, just be aware that we are creating a world and an environment that humanity's not really been designed physically. So we need to make ways for our Paleolithic operating systems to still work in the reality of today.
I'm with you. I mean, look, I appreciate what you've said there. Not everybody would agree with in the audience. And I think there's aspects of what you were sharing that I certainly agree with, in terms of having the hardware that isn't necessarily the most fitting for what would be a huge technology advancement in the last 20, 30, 40 years. I see it a lot where companies are introducing technology within the organization, and there may well be people across generations here. I don't think it's a generational issue as such, that experience challenges in how to adopt that technology in a way that's best fitting for the organization. But I want to try and bring it back to what is essentially the purpose of this podcast, which is about sharing, information around people objectives, around HR wisdom and learning and development. As far as I'm concerned, is a huge portion of HR. It's one of the best ways you can engage with people. It's also one of the best ways you can increase productivity, not just within a business, but within a country. If you look at the educational focus that countries have, it has a direct influence on productivity within those organizations, within those countries, GDP. It all goes up if you give people the tools in order for them to do the job. And I think that the challenge can sometimes be, from a HR point of view, business owners want to get the best out of their players, the best out of their team and their employees, but finding the sweet spot can be incredibly challenging based on the dynamic of the team that they're working with, based on the generational differences sometimes will play a part in this too. So really what we're trying to explore in this conversation is, okay, well, what actually is the challenge? And I think you've put forward some suggestions there that actually could lead to being part of answering, okay, well, what is the challenge in the first place? And I think once you can define what the problem is, it's a lot easier. Half the problem solved immediately by defining what the challenge is to begin with. And I believe social media has a huge impact on this. We spoke earlier about that idea of perfection, and that whilst people can be incredibly energetic and these influences can be very positive, that there are aspects of the confidence that's being demonstrated doesn't necessarily link to the knowledge that that person has, which again is an interesting subject in itself. So it's okay, we need to build that confidence in people. But the way you do that, in my view, is by creating an environment for them where they can put their repetitions in, as we said at the very beginning of the podcast. I think it's definitely worth a further conversation on this, Barnaby. It's been fantastic exploring some of these concepts with you today. Yeah. Were there any areas that you wanted to mention that we've not yet had an opportunity to?
I think we've covered loads. There is expertise out there, so don't be afraid to go looking where there's expertise. Don't try and always solve it in-house. Also, possibly for a next podcast topic, we are seeing a massive rise in neurodivergence in the workplace. Yes. Again, people asking questions of how do we facilitate this? How do we make allowance? How do we make reasonable adjustments? And again, there are loads of expert voices out there to guide you on this.
Absolutely. I think it's really helpful to get that different perspective that an outsider can bring to an organisation. So linking it to the type of work that you and I do, we can make ourselves available through consulting, through our managed HR services at OES. And if that's something you're interested, if you wish to connect with Barnaby and I, you can connect with us on LinkedIn. Barnaby, is there any areas you'd like to direct our audience to keep in touch with you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Barnaby Cook, or I've got the hashtag workplace thinking. If you type that in, you'll come up with any of my articles on how we can improve our workspaces.
Fantastic. Well, I'll be looking forward to welcoming you back to the People Prescription podcast at OES HR. If anybody's interested in getting involved with the podcast, let me know. You can message me on LinkedIn, Richard Tunnicliffe, or alternatively, you can download our HR Doctor app off iOS or Android. Really appreciate your advice today, Barnaby, and your insights. And thanks everybody for listening, and we'll look forward to the next one.